Okay, hope this is helpful. I just want to cover the reading for Common School, Common Man. This is a lot of information, so I'm just going to try to go through and really sort of clarify the key points. And what I always want students to know by the end were the what fueled kind of public school development, what forces contributed to it, why they were established, the aims of the early schools, and then we'll talk about specific things like the feminization of teaching. We'll talk about Michael Catt's critique of the schools, and then we'll look at a couple. When we look at, like, for example, the influences, we'll kind of break that down to a couple key different points, and I'll give you some of those specific influences. So one of the things to realize is that this time was a period, at least in the Mid Atlantic, in the north part of the country, urbanization, a period of urbanization. And so even Jefferson, by the time he died, as the reading notes, began to notice that life in the United States was changing dramatically. Both people were flocking to the cities, and then also taking up jobs in in factories, basically in industrial factories. So prior to this time period, a lot of people would have learned their trade through a kind of apprenticeship, whether that was agriculture or masonry or carpentry. You would be accepted into a guild. You would learn this kind of complicated skill, and you would have that sort of skill to work on over a period of time. When you're working in a factory, usually you're at least at this time period, you're completing one part of a task, and so that changes things dramatically. Also, with people flocking to cities, you have all the problems associated with city crime, um, you know, the need for cleanliness, all those kinds of things. And so it creates a kind of anxiety in that time period. This was especially a period of gangs and even like urban warfare in some areas. Massachusetts was, for a period of time, pretty unstable. And that leaves the one quote that I like students to remember from the reading that sort of hits at this is Orville Taylor's quote, which is, "Look, we either need books or bayonets, we need soldiers or schoolmasters." Meaning, we either need to, you know, squash unrest in the cities through force, or we need another outlet for people, another approach to it. All right, so one of the people who become really influential in this time period and have a major impact here is Andrew Jackson. And Jackson um, was basically thought of, or at least resonated with, everyday people. This was a period like today. I mean, we're in another period of populism. Both Bernie Sanders, who was really popular on the left, and President Trump, who was popular on some, you know what I mean, with the right, is are considered at least people who have populist sort of sentiments, which is a complicated issue or complicated impact. But with Jackson, he was from Tennessee. He had been in wars. He just came from a different background than the presidents we had previously. He was conservative, what we would today call conservative, at least in terms of wanting to remove the federal government from financial affairs, from people's lives in different ways. So limited federal government. I mentioned that I kind of cut off the picture here, but President Trump uh, resonates. He was been compared to Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson is somebody that I think he identifies with. He hung a painting of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, and has referenced him in a number of different ways. And Andrew Jackson was known as somebody who really kind of shook things up, who wasn't a traditional politician, and stoked a lot of kind of different reactions in people, um, perhaps in a way that's similar to today. One of the things that Andrew Jackson, I think, is important to remember, because next week we'll talk about the Native American boarding schools, and so I like to mention that Andrew Jackson is associated with the Trail of Tears, and many consider him associated with a genocide of Native Americans. So, to give you an example of this, there's even some Indian casinos that won't accept $20 bills because Jackson's face is printed on them. There's that kind of level of animosity among the Native community in relation to Jackson. So what happens though is Jackson is so popular at that time period that it creates a counter movement, and so that's where you get the Whig Party. The Whig Party was kind of a third party for a period of time, and they basically were on the other side of the political fence, but tried to appeal to everyday people. Um, so to basically capture the same supporters of Jackson, but through the idea of a strong central government, or at least a central government that would address the needs of everyday people. And they argued, look, the government can play a role in making the lives of people better through building roads, building bridges, building an infrastructure, hospitals, and of course their lasting contribution was public schools. And Andrew, or when we get to Horace Mann was part of the Whig Party and kind of came up through the Whig Party. As a quick side note, the Whig Party kind of later evolves into the Republican Party, and that's around the time when uh, um, I'm completely spacing out on the name right now. Abraham Lincoln becomes a part of the party. Um, So, okay, the common schools basically, again, what we would today call public schools, those two terms are synonymous. When we say common school, we're talking about it's just a different term used at that time period for public schools. Um, One of the things I mentioned was some of the kind of the attributes of the early schools, and we'll get into those, or I'll clarify those. Um, when I mentioned the influences, two we've kind of talked about already: urbanization, people flocking to cities. That's the story. Like, my family came from rural areas in Maryland and Pennsylvania, moved to Baltimore, and for work in the steel mill. One of my grandfathers, and then the other one was a longshoreman. So industrial kind of jobs in cities. And then the other thing that happens this time period is immigration, and we had droves of people coming from Ireland at this time period. Um, and so they were considered culturally different. They were Catholic, so that it began kind of some religious tension. If you're familiar with the relationship between England and Ireland and different parts of Ireland, there's that tension between Protestants and Catholics that developed during this time period. And so that fuels a kind of need for assimilation, and that's a big part of the early school movement is to create social stability, to deal with what do you do with industrialization, where you have all these kids now who aren't, when you pass child labor laws, they're not working in factories, but you don't want them out on the street all day. Parents need to work or have other things, and then you want to assimilate a large group of people into the kind of culture, and schools become sort of tasked with doing that. All right, so a key figure that I want you to remember in this this week and in relation to this reading is Horace Mann, and the way to remember him, he's remembered as the father of the public schools, or the father of the common school movement, and that might be a little bit too simplistic because there were a number of other people who were advocating for education in a school system, but he was really kind of the most influential and one of the key figures. One of the people I think teachers should be familiar with. There are many schools around the country named after him, and he had a major impact that we'll kind of get to. So it's helpful to sort of to understand him, because then I think you understand how schools developed. He was Secretary of Education for Massachusetts, wrote a bunch of reports that became very influential, helped establish a system in Massachusetts that then spread kind of throughout the region. And again, to go back to the point about urbanization, immigration, and industrialization, one of the things you can see, this is in the kind of the Northeast. The South developed a public education system later, and the South has always kind of been a bit behind other states when it comes to educational development. And that stems back to this time period and the fact that the South was more agrarian, it more based in farming, didn't have as much immigration. So since those things happened slower in the South, public schools developed more slowly, at least in the South. So what Horace Mann did was he traveled the world, and he went to France and England and different countries and kind of looked at their school system, and wanted to kind of develop a model for the United States built on what he liked in those other systems. And the one that he really settled on was the Prussian school system. Prussia was a part of what today we would look at as sort of the area where Germany and Poland is, and they had a lot of the same issues they had that we had. They had groups of people who, like clans, maybe people who were from different ethnic backgrounds. That they wanted to create in that region a common culture, language, things like that. So he took that system and took many of the key aspects of it. I think today there are things we take for granted, but were unique for that time period. So state funded through a tax system, compulsory, so you had to send your children, or at least you can homeschool, but you have to make some sort of provisions or provide evidence that they're receiving an education. Grade system, the idea that kids go in at a certain age and they progress through the system sort of collectively as a kind of cohort based on their age. And then universal, and that needs quotes on it because we'll see that while they did allow kids, who were poor, or maybe, kids who were Irish and otherwise discriminated against, girls as well, they were coeducational. Still, we had segregation and other issues at that time period. All right. So what Mann did was basically, I sent you this graphic organizer, and there are important key points related to these two areas. And that's his appeal to the wealthy and then his appeal to the working class. And what I like for you to identify is both the resistance and then how he tried to overcome that. So for the wealthy, they really vision schools. It's kind of like, why would I want to pay for the education of someone else's children? The wealthy could maintain their social status by giving their children an education because they could afford a private school. So they didn't see a kind of vested interest in wanting to provide opportunity to all kids who would then compete against their children for a place in society. And what Mann did was basically, these were factory owners, business owners who were wealthy during that time period. So he appealed to them by saying, look, educated workers, are they don't show up at work drunk. They show up, they're punctual. You can kind of make them into what you want. They're malleable, they're docile, they're more compliant. And the big one is, he said, they will accept their place in the social hierarchy. So people won't challenge their place in the social hierarchy if they're educated. And he even had other business owners write letters that he published in his reports, those kind of things to persuade the wealthy. For the working class, their resistance was, and always in class I give the example, I talk about, when I've worked in India and in Pakistan, that this is still a problem today. Child labor still creates a big barrier for a lot of children in terms of educational access. And that was for this time period in the United States. A lot of people would have relied on their children for additional income. And what Mann said is, he said to the poor, he said, it will allow your children to climb the social ladder. Like, ultimately, in time, they will make more money, they will be better off, they'll climb. And he had a lot of great rhetoric, like lofty rhetoric, that schools were the great balance wheel of the social machinery, that they would eliminate differences between the classes. So it should be pretty obvious in looking at these that he's basically telling kind of both sides almost what they want to hear, but also contradictory information, or contradicting, So in that respect, he was either a good politician, because schools developed more quickly in the United States than they did in some other areas. But I think the impact of this, the lasting impact, was that schools didn't, and I really think in some ways have never had a clear mandate. We see schools as kind of preparing kids or trying to help the economy, which, is understandable. In Indiana, we want, there's a lot of talk about workforce development, preparing kids for the emerging economy, those types of things. And then at the same time, I think there's still, at least within schools, somewhat of an ethos of kind of preparing kids, or giving kids a leg up, allowing kids to compete, to be competitive, to have that opportunity, for the American dream, to live out your goals, to aspire to what you want to be. It's not that I guess in some ways those goals can't coexist in some ways, but I think at the same time too, they haven't always been coherent through the 20th century. And when we get into IQ testing, tracking, and some other issues, segregation, we'll look at how those two kind of emphasis can conflict and create problems for each other. So one of the other things that I like to mention, and this is important, is that Mann wanted to fund schools through property taxes, and that is still the primary way that schools are funded around the country today. And in Mann's time, I think this probably wasn't as problematic as it is today. Um, More people probably were tended to sort of live together. Districts were large enough um, to accommodate that. The map that I have posted in the PowerPoint, I have a few different maps, but this is kind of a breakdown of per pupil spending um, by different districts, and you can see there's massive disparities among states, but also, and I'll give you Indiana as an example. Within most states, there's also a lot of disparities. So the red would be at the low end, in the four, five, $6,000 per, annually per student. Where in the green, the dark green you see on the other side of the spectrum, those areas spend sometimes $30,000 to $40,000 per student annually. That's a huge, huge gap. And then when you think about each student in a school and how that adds up exponentially, some schools are operating with tremendous amounts of funding, whereas other schools are have very limited funding. And that's really an impact and kind of ongoing issue today from the property tax issue. Now, what Indiana has done, and I'll kind of give you an example here. Indiana did create what's called a general fund, and that is they take money from sales tax and income tax and put that into a pot, and that helps pay teacher salaries. So that helps offset some of the disparities in terms of teacher pay, which I think has been a positive thing. On the other side of the spectrum, Indiana incorporated a property tax cap at 2%, and that's had a really big impact on education in Indiana. So certain districts, for example, like Muncie, have been really impacted by it. And part of the reason for that is if you look at some districts like Fishers or even just our neighboring district in Yorktown, they have quite a bit of residential areas and some areas with valuable property, um, and not as much uninhabited property or rental properties or other things like that. With Muncie, the two most valuable pieces of land, the hospital, the university, those are nonprofit, and they don't pay property taxes. Um, and this isn't just a problem in Muncie. Obviously, it's a problem in other urban areas or other cities. And I think one that creates a kind of weird momentum in one direction or the other. So with Muncie, the school system suffers. People are less inclined to want to live here or prefer to maybe live in one of the neighboring districts. Property values go down, school funding goes down. I think you can kind of get the cycle there. Whereas other districts have a kind of positive momentum where the quality of education goes up, people want to live there, property values go up, the schools get more funding. So it's been a really problematic feature, and I think one that's been really hard to fix. One of the things the federal government has done is has provided Title I funding. Now, this by no means erases all of the disparities, and federal funding is only a small portion of overall school funding. But this does provide, this is Title I is the school free lunch program, provides free and reduced lunch for students. That's kind of what it's known for most widely. But it also offers funds for curriculum, data coaches, extra school personnel. It helps supplement and deal with some of those funding disparities. And every school in Muncie, as a quick side note, is Title I. And when you look at the statistics for most of the schools in Muncie, more than half of all the students in the school receive free and reduced lunch, which is an indicator of poverty. You receive those benefits if your family income meets the poverty standards. All right. So I want to talk a little bit more about Horace Mann, and there's some issues, things that I mentioned in generally in my lecture that aren't as important to know. I don't hold you accountable for it. He was influenced by a European thinker named Pestalozzi, who took his ideas from Rousseau and basically argued for a more child-centered curriculum, something we would look at today as kind of like a Montessori sort of approach, or a Reggio-inspired. I think this is always interesting. There in New Harmony, and there's a town in southern Indiana where there was a Pestalozzi and kind of utopian community that developed. Like most utopian communities, it kind of fizzled out in time, but the remnants are still there. You can still go there and see um, some of the old buildings, and the education system was a key feature of this kind of utopian community. Preniology was influential on Horace Mann. He was caught up in this idea. In this time period, people thought you could like measure people's skulls and tell things about them, that each center of the brain, different parts of the brain had like almost like different sizes based on like how maybe caring somebody was, or how that you could look at the shape of somebody's skull and basically tell, like, were they kind of prone towards criminal behavior, were they loving, were they it's a complete quack science. I mean, there's nothing valid about it. But I think the good thing about it related to man was that the other idea here was that these parts of the brain were like muscles, and you could exercise them and get better. So you could, if you practice being more caring, you could be a more caring, compassionate person. If you practiced being more empathetic, being more disciplined, being more motivated, all those kinds of things were like muscles that you could develop. And that, I think, was a positive influence that impacted Mann's views of education. Kind of related to this, he spoke out against corporal punishment and beating kids at that time period, which was prevalent in schools. The kind of spare the rod, spoil the child, or whatever. That use of force to control students. And what Mann wanted was, he wanted kids to internalize self-discipline. He wanted kids to learn those things on their own, and to be motivated on their own to do that, rather than to behave only because they worried about getting hit. And when I talk about this in class, I mentioned that that a number of states, the ones in gray here, have corporal punishment still in schools, which surprises some students. And then Indiana still has corporal punishment allowed. Now, Indiana, it's limited to district, like each district decides what they want to do, and a lot of districts in Indiana have banned it, but there are a number that still use corporal punishment. Generally, most semesters I have at least one student who went to a school where they had corporal punishment, and some of them, do recall being paddled or hit or whatever. There are different policies. According to the Justice Department statistics I saw, Indiana has about 300 cases about 400 cases per year. Alabama, other southern states have about 30,000, 40,000. And I posted a video on this on the Canvas site, so you're welcome to watch that. But it's an interesting paper topic if you're interested in, and just something I'd like you to be aware of in relation to today. So in the beginning, I mentioned the feminization of teaching. This is basically, there were 3 reasons that women were targeted to be teachers early on. They were seen as more nurturing and caring, so it was more in line with, the early idea of the schools were, the term was loco parentis, which kind of in place of the parent. And so women were seen as kind of aligning with that kind of vision. The other one was that you could pay teachers, and this was probably one of the main ones, is that really you could pay teachers a third, if not a fourth, of what you would pay a man, because you had an unlimited labor supply. Women didn't have other options. And for a lot of women who didn't want to get married right after leaving the home, it provided a little bit of a buffer, an opportunity to at least be somewhat independent or somewhat some level of self determination, and so women did go into teaching. It was an opportunity for them, and but unfortunately they weren't compensated appropriately. And then third, men still occupied period like the roles of like administrator and senior teacher, those kinds of things. So it didn't seem to be breaking too dramatically with traditional kind of gendered stereotypes or gendered roles. And women, I always think, if you get a chance to look over the rules for teachers, they're kind of hysterical by today's standards. But a key point is that women were. It was thought they would teach for a few years or whatever. They would eventually get married, and then go on to have a family. Like, it wasn't considered to be a career. And I think that too, this has really had a lasting impact. Teaching tends to trail other professions with similar credentialing in terms of pay. There's a pay gap that's existed over time, and something that people are trying to address today. So, so I feel like we've talked about Horace Mann. Another contribution that I'd like you to be familiar with is the normal school, and this was part of the Prussian system that Mann brought here. And these were 2-year training institutes that trained people to be primarily women to be teachers. And most of these have evolved and turned into colleges. That's happened around the country. Normal schools were started and then they eventually evolved and became maybe a college, but then they became slowly a university. And of course, that's Ball State's trajectory or history. This is Ball State here in the picture. This is from an old newspaper, and then these are old postcards. They show the old administration building, but the administration building was the original normal school that existed in Muncie. And I always think a lot of women were really brave at that point to go off to a school, to leave home, and to kind of venture out on their own. A lot of women, even like, for example, after the Civil War, went to the South to work with African American students after slavery. So it just to move away and to go out on their own, I thought would have been brave at that time period. So I think this is something we're going to talk about as the semester progresses. We'll talk a little bit about teacher organizations, but basically what's happened is that after the Great Recession, other professions rebounded and pay increased to compensate for what was lost during the Great Recession. Teaching actually hasn't rebounded and has actually dropped. It hasn't kept up even with inflation or the cost of living increases. And so if you're not familiar, there have been teacher protests and walkouts around the country. It started, I think, in Virginia and then spread to like Oklahoma, Arizona, even Kentucky, and then Indiana was one of the states as well. And Indiana has a significant gap. So with Michael Katz, his critique, he was a famous historian from Penn, University of Pennsylvania, and he argued that the common schools, public schools, were really a system of social control that the elite used to try to control the working class and the poor. Now he used, as we talked about some of Mann's own words in his argument. He used some of Mann's writing. He also used, I think, some questionable evidence. I think a number of people would critique Katz and reject his view, but the interesting thing, I think, is that he did set off really a debate. And I think whereas previously people had always looked at schools as benevolent institutions for the greater good, Katz critiqued them in a way, I think, that helped bring a little bit more complexity to the way that we look at schools and in that sense, I think that's kind of helpful. All right, so I'm going to go through these three areas: religion, gender, and religion. With race, the schools were, non-white students or African American students. There was community of freed slaves in Massachusetts around the time of Horseman. They were not included in his plans. At least they didn't adequately address it. I always think this is an interesting case. Sarah Roberts was a young girl who walked past multiple white schools to get to her segregated African American school. Her father, just like with the Brown case, her father sued. It went to court in Massachusetts. At first, the court said that the segregation wasn't right and allowed her to go to the white school. Then it kind of overturned that case. So basically, what Urban says, the author, is that it left unresolved an issue that would fester throughout the 20th century. And so it was like, basically, if you look at this as being the late 1840s, there's basically 100 years until you get to the Brown decision, outlawing segregation. With religion, schools were felt to have a strong Protestant bias. Catholics reacted to this. They began setting up Catholic schools for their kids, but eventually schools did move to be more secular, and Protestants and Catholics did go to school together. And I always think this really resolves a lot of problems. I think when kids go to school together, they realize they're not so different. They realize, they have very similar interests and concerns and things like that. They become friends. They become acclimated to one another. And so if you look at places where kids are segregated, and don't go to school together, I think this is still an issue sometimes in the Muslim world, where there's a divide between Sunni and Shia. So I just think that when kids go to school together, it helps resolve some of those issues. And eventually schools got to where they needed to be. But they started off non-sectarian, which means they didn't have an official religious affiliation by any means. But I think the overwhelming feeling at the time was that they had a Protestant bias toward Catholics. In terms of gender, schools were co-educational. I've mentioned a few weeks ago that this, I think, was one of the best decisions in our country's history, that it provided opportunity to young women. I think it had a dramatic influence on the direction of our country. And so when it comes, people talk about gender bias in schools, but I really think if you look at the history of schools, it's very complicated. There's a lot of positive, a lot of good that's happened, and at times bias and problems as well, but by no means a simplistic story. Catherine Beecher is someone who's talked about in the reading, and I'd just like to mention really quickly with her, her husband was a Yale professor who died, I think, right around maybe before they got married, when they were engaged. And so she kind of dedicated her life to women's education, and she started opening seminaries. And these were the first opportunities for higher education for women, and they spread throughout the first on the East Coast and then throughout the Midwest. And they kind of got away with it because they were promoting domestic lives, cultivating women into good wives and mothers. But they did take on a more liberal education and giving women exposure to sciences and reading more complicated on different topics and issues. And so they really kind of laid the framework for what later became women's colleges. Women's colleges developed in the United States, and then higher education opportunities for women. Most women's colleges now admit men, but there's a number that have a historic commitment to women's education. And many of the leaders who've come out of our country who are women have come through these schools. All right, so I hope that kind of helps clarify the reading and the key points for it. So I will follow up with some notes and some more information.